I want to start off tonight with a little bit of a loaded question, so I apologize in advance. But really quickly, show of hands, how many of you believe that our country is headed in a negative direction? Generally speaking, show of hands, one or two of you. Okay, 2/3 to 3/4. Well, congratulations. I want you to know as an audience, you're very average. Nationally speaking, roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans believe just like you that our country is headed in a negative direction. What's more interesting is that actually you're very average, historically speaking. And in the 40 years that Gallup has been administering this survey, almost the entire time, roughly 2/3 of Americans have believed that our country's been heading in a negative direction. Congratulations. Now, there's been some blips on the radar. There's been a few moments of joy and good times. But what's really, really fascinating is in that 40-year period, can you guess the time and period where we as a people, the vast majority of us said that our country was headed in a positive direction? It was the 4 months following 9/11. Now, at first, this doesn't make a lot of sense, right? This was a period of great tragedy, of great loss. But yet when we look through history, we see time and time again that tragedy often brings out the best in us, and it unifies us together as a people. That we come together and we say, you know what, there's bigger things at hand that we really need to take care of. And Sebastian Junger has coined this phrase, the upside of disaster. In his book, he talks about just periods in history where you see this phenomenon over and over again. And he refers to one moment in Osavano, Italy, where an earthquake killed 95% of the citizens. And he quotes one of the survivors who says, "The earthquake gave us what the law promises but does not in fact deliver, which is the equality of all men." And I was having this conversation with Fletch, our MC, a few weeks ago, and he had this great comment. He said, what we're really looking for, what we really want, is unity without tragedy. If we could only find something to unify us with that wasn't a tragic event, that would really be the ideal. And what I've seen in my context as city engagement director for Love Our Cities, and working with over 60 cities across the nation, is time and time again, we found that people love where they live, right? We care about our city, we care about the place that we live, and it can be this unifying force that draws people together. And the idea that I want to really express and talk about tonight is if we're unhappy with the narrative of our nation, at the end of the day, we've got to recognize that we as its citizens are the narrators. And that if we're upset with the narrative, then we've really got to start thinking about what our role is in changing that narrative. And I'd like to share a little bit about the Love Our City story, where it started, and some of the principles that we've been learning that we think are critical for changing the narrative of a city and a nation. So in 2008, we had a pastor here locally in Modesto, and he was looking at the narrative of Modesto, right? At that time, Modesto was height of the recession, kind of what Eric was talking about. It was ranked one of the worst places in America to live. And we had high unemployment, high foreclosure rate, right? Students were showing up to church literally with shirts that say Modesto sucks on them. Hopefully none of you here were doing that. And he said, we've got to address this, right? And he started looking at the church and his church, and he asked this question that I think it's kind of a question of futility, but I think we all need to ask from time to time is, if the church were to disappear tomorrow, if we were to go away, would anyone notice or care? And it wasn't that the church wasn't doing good things, it was. But there seemingly was this disconnect between what was happening in the church and then what was happening in the rest of the community. So the pastor said, we need to change this narrative. So the first thing he did, almost mockingly to the Modesto sucks people, is he said, let's make shirts that say, I love Modesto. Great starting point. Then he turned around and said, okay, let's go to all the people, all the stakeholders in the community. Let's go to the city manager's office, to nonprofits, to schools, and say, hey, if we were to get a bunch of people together to volunteer, what could we do? And they came up with 8 or 9 projects. They expected about 100 people. And over 1,100 people showed up at the event. And from that experience, Love Modesto was born. And as it grew over the years, And more people started to show up. They said, you know what we need to do is we need to have this rally, and we need to have it at a neutral location. Actually, it's right outside this building, right? We shut down 2 city blocks. This year we had over 3,500 people, and we said, let's have an hour that just shows people, you know what? There's others out here who think like we do, that care about our city. I might not know them. They might look a little bit different than me, but that's okay. The one unifying thing we have going for us is that we care about where we live. And then after that, we push them out the door and we send them to different places around town. And we have them work on volunteer projects, from fixing up homes to working on parks to painting schools. And as we did this over time, more and more cities began to say, we like what you're doing. Can you help us? So we started providing services for other cities. And like I said, today we now work with over 60 cities nationwide. That number continues to grow almost every month. This year we've had over 20,000 volunteers go through our program. We've had over 111,000 since our inception. And the thing that's really cool that we get to see is this beautiful collaboration between the faith-based sector, city government, nonprofits, businesses, all rallying around this one unifying idea that's changing the narrative of our cities. And I think underlying that, there's probably 3 principles that I would pull out that I would say are really important if we're going to think about changing a narrative. The first one is that we have to demonstrate civility. And by civility, this is a term that's almost become outdated in our age, sadly. But when we talk about civility, it's really looking at someone not as a bunch of ideals, but seeing them in all of their humanity. And as I love to use our definition of love our cities to demonstrate civility, because I think it's packed with some interesting nuggets. And I'll start with love. If I'm going to use a definition of the word love, I'll use a psychology term or definition that states that love is a sacrifice of oneself for the spiritual growth of another. It's a sacrifice of oneself for the growth of another, which means at the end of the day that love has a cost. Whether it's emotional, physical, spiritual, whether that's time or money, there's something that we actually have to invest in someone else if we're really truly going to love them. We see this in marriages, with children, with friends. And then we look at the word cities. And sometimes when we think of cities, we think of roads, parks, monuments, bridges, sports teams. But if you really go back and look at the root word of cities, the Latin word means citizens. So when we talk about loving our cities, we're not talking about loving a place, but a people. And so in that, if we're going to change the narrative of our cities, we have to ask the question, do others know that we care? Really, the first question we have to ask is, do we care, right? Assuming that that's a good response, though, then it really becomes, do others know that we care, and can we demonstrate civility? The second thing that we need to have is a need for humility. Now, a couple years ago, a friend of mine invited me to a meeting that had faith-based leaders with city government. And I promise you it was not in Modesto, it was somewhere else. I promise you. And so we walk into this meeting, and it was all about homelessness. And the city, basically, the conversation started like this. Faith-based sector. We love the fact that you have a heart to help the homeless, and that you come into town, and that you provide these services, and you feed them, and you do these things. Now, you and I all know when someone leads in like that, right, the hammer's about to drop, right? It's like, this is the yeah, but conversation, right? And they say, however, we need you to stop. And we need you to stop because what you're actually doing is undercutting all the services that we're trying to provide and working with other nonprofits in the community. And then this part, and to be honest this day, I'm not sure if they were joking or telling the truth, but literally in this meeting they say, you're actually creating a second problem for us, which is homeless obesity. And so, but the point is that sometimes I think we look at an issue and it's really easy to have this 30,000-foot view of the problem, right? We look at something like homelessness and we say, black and white issue. Homeless people must be hungry. We have food, we have people, let's rally the troops, let's go downtown, let's feed them. Everybody wins. But yet we see time and time again, and I think we all know this inherently, that when you actually get on the front lines, when you actually get up close to what's going on, issues are never black and white. They're always shades of gray. That solutions are complicated, Problems are complicated. Solutions need to be holistic. And oftentimes when we see a problem, and this happens in Modesto too, is we'll see 10 groups all addressing the same issue on islands separated from each other, not talking. And what I would suggest with this idea of a need for humility is instead of doing that, why don't we start looking around the people in our community and saying, hey, who's already working on the front lines? Who's doing the hard work day in and day out that have invested their whole life doing this, and then ask them my favorite question in the job that I do. How can we help? No strings attached. Because if you go and you do that to someone who's literally invested their whole life meeting the needs of your community, and they give you a request and you actually fulfill that, nothing puts wind in their sails more. So we need to have a need for humility if we're going to change the narrative of our communities and recognize that we don't always have all the answers, but that we can look for people who do, and let's resource them as best as we can, because that will change the narrative of our cities. The third thing that we need to have is we need to discover commonality. And by commonality, what I mean is we shouldn't look at people about what they're against, but we need to look at them about what they're for. Which means that I can look at someone and recognize, I'm not going to agree with you on everything, right? I don't agree with my spouse on everything, right? I'm not going to agree with you on everything, but the question becomes, what do we agree on, right? I might not agree with you politically, but I can recognize that our city has issues that we can agree need to be addressed. I can recognize that we're not always going to agree religiously, but that we're going to be able to say, hey, you know what? We're better working together, and the sum is better than the individual parts, and that the issues of our city need to be addressed. And when you practice civility, humility, and commonality, I can tell you countless stories, we don't have time tonight, of cities who've addressed homelessness, gang violence, teen suicide, housing, across the board. Now, some of you might be sitting here saying, okay, Eric, I get it. That sounds great, awesome. What about me, right? Because let's be honest, this seems really nebulous. How do I change the narrative? You might even just look at Modesto and say, how do I even do something in Modesto? We live in a large city. It's over 200,000 people. What can I do? And the idea I'd like to leave with you tonight is I believe there is one thing that we can all do independently and individually, that if we all did this one thing, I believe the narrative of our cities and our nation would change for the better instantly. And that's to focus on just loving our neighbors. It's a very simple concept. So here's a little bit of a pop quiz. Okay, so that thing in the middle, that's your home. Okay, the red box in the middle, that's you. Okay? Now this box, by the way, was given to us by some friends in Denver, a guy by the name of Dave Runyon. And we've used it a lot around here, so you might have seen this before. So bear with me if you have. But your house is the one in the middle, okay? So the 8 boxes around that are your neighbors. Okay, picture their homes. You might live in an apartment, court, block, whatever, right? You can envision that. Now, here's $1 million question. Can you name all of them? First and last name. Now, okay, no, hold on. Now, I know you know what car they drive. I know you know what time they go to work. I know you know what time they come home and how quickly they can get their door up, the car in the door down without having to see anyone. We know those things. But do we know their first and last name? Thank you. Now, and you're not alone, because here's the thing. This test informally has been given over 300,000 times. And on average, 95% of people can't do that. Okay? So here's the question. If we recognize that we're unhappy with the narrative of our nation, and that we at the end of the day are the narrators, right? How do we expect anything to change if we can't provide civility, humility, and commonality to those who literally live closest to us? It's not going to happen. However, I firmly believe that if we can learn to show humility, civility, and commonality to our neighbors, to those who live around us. Our neighborhoods will improve, our cities will strengthen, and the narrative of our country will change for the better. Thank you.